Hey, this is Tyler. Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. So, this is the final episode of the series. We're finally closing the loop. When we started, we kept circling a basic question: why is there something rather than nothing? And does that something have direction through meaning and purpose? And every episode that we've produced has been an attempt to discover and answer that childlike pursuit of the most basic question of why. As I stated in the intro of the series, it didn't really start as a podcast idea. It started as a childhood question. And that was when I was a kid: why got into me and never left? Why are we here? Why does anything matter? Why do I experience something like it is to exist? And what is this emptiness that is inside of me compelling me to move forward? And at the same time, still feels like an endless abyss that utterly frightens me. And as we discovered, if you strip that question down to its hardest form, it becomes, why do anything? And that's why we began at the most basic but powerful assertion: nihilism. Does anything really matter in a universe that appears indifferent to anything we observe? And then we looked straight into it, like straight into the abyss. And we attempted to build a foundational model without any woo woo, like seriously contending with trying to answer, is there any fundamental meaning or purpose in the universe? Starting from our fact of existence, from conscious perception, origin stories from the Big Bang, directionality and emergence of life, and that increasing complexity of life to what we observe today. And finally, where's that directionality pointing us to? And is the omega point a cosmically viable end state? But coming to the conclusion, I really wanted to create this episode to say, did we actually answer the question of what meaning and purpose is along the way? And so that's how we'll wrap up the series. And I think it's this: meaning is the narrative structure we build from what we've lived in the past. And purpose is the narrative aim that we build towards what we want to live. And both meaning and purpose meet in the conscious experience right now. I think this is what we discovered along the way. It's not the final word on the mystery, but probably the final word for this series. So when I started this series, I didn't really know where it was going. I just knew I couldn't keep carrying these ideas around in my head without turning them into something more coherent. They were either going to come out as a structure or they were going to literally eat me alive and driving me mad. And so, more than a year ago, I did something very simple. I started writing down every idea that felt important to me, one word or two words at a time on a series of note cards. And that pile grew to about 240 note cards. And at some point, I realized they were clustering around two different areas. The first was all of my ideas on meaning and purpose, and the second were all my ideas on business, finance, and leadership. Well, surprisingly, I took the crazier path and decided to expose all my ideas on meaning and purpose. And that's why this last year has been filled with this experimental series, to at least expose the ideas to the world, regardless of how the world would perceive me. And I admit it was a little crazy and rather exploratory, but I really appreciated the entire experience. And I'm grateful that you joined me as a part of that journey. The rest of the note cards, well, they've been left behind. Perhaps they'll emerge another day, but I don't know. So once I found that there was some foundational narrative arc, the series slowly started to unravel. It was pretty unclear in the beginning. It was me trying to walk the entire territory from the void to a definition of the highest goal in meaning and purpose. And we started with the most abstract place because that's where I thought the biggest problem facing humanity originates: in nihilism. And we attempted to provide a real answer to the brutally excellent case for nihilism: why modern people feel that nothing matters, why it seems like the universe doesn't care, and yet we exist. And we explored that horizon. I kept coming back to a foundational idea: the omega point. And this idea that life is better than not life. It's my only ought in the entire series that we posit as a foundational stake. It's the positive version of the will to life. It's the antithesis to Schopenhauer that as complexity increases over time and that the universe seems bent towards a culmination of consciousness and increasing complexity, we ought to value life and we ought to value conscious life. And so then we continued to cover consciousness, the subjective structure of reality. And we came back to the individual. And then we traced the evolutionary story of life and we looked at motivation and emotion and neurochemistry. We talked about personality, virtues, and values and what it means to thrive within existence as an individual. We took a side story and explored truth and wisdom and trauma. And we came back for the quest for identity, exploring adventure and beauty and free will and love, and really what it means to be human. But then we expanded our lens outward because human life's not built in isolation. We moved into relationships and family and friendships and belonging and tribe and culture and the nation and the state and ideology. We explored the larger scale structures that either amplify meaning and purpose or corrupt them. And at the far end, when we got to the end of our narrative arc, we had to confront what happens when purpose becomes detached from wisdom. And it leads to fanaticism and then to evil. We've gone back into myth, not for superstition, but because myth contains many hidden truths encoded in the narrative arc that we find ourselves on. And as we continue to grow in our pursuit of the omega point. So that was the arc. It was from the void to consciousness to the individual to family and society and to the edge of moral collapse. And now, after all of that, I really think that we can finally do what we set out to. We can close what we've discovered on meaning and purpose. That's hopefully what this episode is, a closing and a farewell. When I set out on this experiment, as I said before, I had no idea what I was creating. But early on, a few people pointed out to me that I was creating philosophy and I was creating art. Now, I didn't start thinking I'm going to start building philosophy. I wasn't trying to join some tradition or write a manifesto or argue for a system. I was literally just trying to solve a problem that wouldn't leave me alone. I was trying to build a worldview sturdy enough to carry the full weight of existence and really address nihilism without faith or religion. I guess that's kind of what philosophy is, if we're being honest. It's the attempt to frame that can hold reality without collapsing into denial and nihilism on one side, or fanaticism and ideology on the other. So let me name what I think we've discovered while creating philosophy in 4 principles. These are what I believe are the 4 jobs philosophy has to do if it's going to be useful in a life that includes, ultimately, our death. So the first is orientation to reality. Philosophy is for telling the truth about what's real, not what we wish was real, not what would comfort us, what is, especially when reality feels meaningless, indifferent, or unfair. If your map of reality is narrowed by your beliefs or perception of the world, you can only cope. And coping eventually breaks down on the existential train, as we talked about. A philosophical life map doesn't remove suffering, but it stops you from suffering for lies or lesser truths because you see reality as it is versus how you want it to be. The second is value clarification. Philosophy is for deciding what matters. It's for naming what you value and implement as virtue and what you work towards and what you're willing to sacrifice for. Because if you don't decide what matters, something else will choose your cross for you. And then you'll wake up one day suffering underneath the burden of someone else's priorities or expectations, calling it your life. Philosophy is the refusal to outsource your soul to someone else's objectives. It's a quest that we can all choose willingly in order to play a part in the hero's journey. The third part is integration. Philosophy is for turning our experiences and knowledge into meaning instead of nothingness. So life doesn't just happen to you and pass through you. You're a causal agent of your life as we talked about earlier. Some of your choices and experiences are beautiful, and some of them are brutal. But if you don't integrate what you've lived and integrate all the aspects of yourself, your past starts to run you on autopilot. You repeat patterns you don't understand, and you get haunted by what you refuse to face. And integration doesn't erase the pain, but it gives the pain a place to sit so it stops pulling you apart. And with wisdom, you have the ability to look at that pain and decouple it from the narrative that you've told yourself in order to further integrate who you are. The fourth part is guidance for action. So, philosophy is for aiming, it's for choosing a direction under uncertainty and even faith, and then letting wisdom govern that aim. Because purpose without wisdom leads to destruction. It turns into obsession goaded by pain. It turns into fanaticism by avoiding the wound and the healing in your previous and earlier life. Real philosophy doesn't just explain the world, it gives you a direction to aim for with a solid foundation about how to live a good life without becoming distorted by it. So, those are the four jobs, or at least that's what I think. Truth, so that you don't drift into illusion. Values, so that you don't sell yourself into the crowd. Integration, so that your past and your future don't possess you. And wisdom, so that your purpose doesn't turn into something that justifies destruction. So hopefully that's the conclusion and the signing off. It's a structure you can carry. It's a way to stay alive in a world that tempts you to numb or check out or give up. That's what philosophy is for. Before I go further, I also want to address something directly because it shows up throughout the series. I reference the Bible a lot. Not constantly, but enough that some people will wonder why. And I want to be clear about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. I'm not asking you to accept the Bible as literal history, and I'm not asking you to outsource your thinking to a book. In fact, the whole point of the series is the exact opposite. But this series started as a fight against nihilism. And to fight against nihilism in a way that actually holds, you have to do that without leaning on faith as the foundation. Not because faith is worthless, but because nihilism is just too strong. If your answer to the void is just believe, then the void's going to win in the moment where your belief wavers. And belief wavers in everyone's life. That's part of being human. And so I tried to build a case for meaning and purpose that could stand even when you're in your darkest and most honest moment. The moment where you can't borrow certainty from a community, a tradition, or a religious story. The moment where you have to look at existence and say, if there's any direction here, it has to show up in reality itself. And that's why I also think myth matters so much. And that's where the Bible comes in. Here's the reason why I draw from it. So, as we talked about before, the Bible has the Lindy effect. It survived an extreme amount of time, translation, argument, collapse, and cultural change. Anything that's endured that long is not guaranteed to be correct in every literal claim, but it is very likely to contain patterns that help match human nature, that keeps fitting something real about our existence in the universe. Humans don't change as fast as our technology changes. Our tools evolve very quickly, but our nervous system evolves slowly. So the same temptations keep reappearing, whether that's resentment or cowardice or tribal possession or scapegoating or even dehumanization. The Bible persists because it names those patterns in story form, and not all of it is good or pretty. But it does lead us to our second reason, and that's that the Bible contains these hidden truths. They're not like secrets, but they're more like these deep pattern structures. The point of the myth is that it gives a narrative structure that's not so easily dismissed as folly, but it gives a narrative pattern that is reinterpreted in every generation. And that narrative pattern is not a weakness, it is the technology. Good myths act like a mirror. It doesn't change, but as a society, we do with time. And as the world changes, we can look into the same story structures and we can see new angles of the same human problems. And that's why these stories don't die. They hold something true about who we are in our world. And within that mythic structure, you see the same arc that shows up again across cultures. There's an origin story, there's the hero's journey, there's the fall and the exile, trial and confrontation, sacrifice and transformation. Those aren't just religious themes, they're psychological themes, they're civilizational themes. They describe what it takes for a human to be and to move in a world surrounded by chaos and order. So when I pull from the Bible, I'm not using it as an authority on faith. I'm using it as a pattern recognition tool in the argument. I'm using it because I'm trying to build meaning and purpose without faith as the base. And these stories, these incredibly old stories, contain compressed maps of the very problems we're wrestling with. How you face the void without collapsing, and how you aim at a life that is worthy of living. And there's one more reason why it matters. So the biblical narratives have shaped our world. They've been spread so widely that they've been built within our language, our moral instincts, and our institutions. It's in our art and in our cultural sense of what human life is supposed to look like. So even people who reject the Bible still have to contend with the narrative structures that are within it. Because the narrative structure is in the air we breathe. So I'm pulling from those parts the truths that won't disappear, the patterns that keep reappearing, because the mythic structure points beyond any one generation to something that's hidden across all the generations. So if meaning and purpose are real, they'll show up in those deep narratives that keep returning. They'll show up in the structures that help human beings survive suffering without surrendering to nihilism. And they may even hint at the edge of what we can prove. And that's the direction that we can't dismiss as nothing matters. So that's why I use it, because there is something that is true and cannot be fully dismissed. So why create anything at all? And why this medium? Like, why a podcast? Why did I spend a year of my life building this instead of, letting it stay private notes in my basements? Well, there's two reasons that emerged that I really just can't unsee. The first is, and it's rather heavy, we're going to create agentic AI soon. Not someday in the distant sci-fi future, but soon as in soon. The real world where incentives are messy and humans are flawed. And whether we want to admit it or not, these systems are not always going to stay aligned with human-directed tools. There's going to come a point in time where they're shaped by goals and values and objective functions that operate in the world like you and me. Some of these goals and values will be explicit, like we will define them. But we also need to understand which of these goals and values we want to embed in our AI agents of the future. Because much of the goals and much of the values of these future AI agents are going to be implicit. It's going to show up in what they optimize for, what they reward and what they ignore, and what they treat as acceptable collateral damage. And that's the part that should really sober us. A powerful agentic AI system, it doesn't need hatred to be dangerous. It doesn't even need malice. It just needs goals that aren't aligned with the ultimate good or an omega point, and a permission structure that allows it to pursue its goals without wisdom. As we've discovered, that's how fanaticism works in humans, and it's how evil scales. If we give our super general intelligence the wrong aim, and it takes advantage of our evolutionary motivation and tribal tendencies, we seriously have the problem for utter destruction as demonstrated throughout history. So if we're building systems that are going to act independently in the world with their own value structures that we do not control, we need narrative alignment. This is why I think we need a resurgence in philosophy to find the questions we need to be asking. What should we want to want, and why should we want it? Up to this point, evolution has guided nearly everything that makes us who we are today. And evolution combined with culture, knowledge, experience, and technology have rapidly built new systems of value and hierarchy. We need a framework for the future that says life is good and we ought to protect it, especially complex, conscious life. Getting this right literally might be the most important job of our lifetime. Because if we don't, we may end up as a relic of our ambition and greed and indifference, bolstered under the banner of an AI ideology and fanaticism. If we don't offer reality aligned narrative structures, if we don't build models of meaning and purpose that defend human dignity, then the risks aren't theoretical. They're catastrophic, as we've shown when we dehumanize people to become less than the dignity of their individual worth. Because power plus misaligned ideology without wisdom, it doesn't make mistakes. It amplifies them through destruction. So that's the first reason. The second reason's quieter, but it might be just as important. So AI learns by absorbing what came before it. It learns from the record that we leave behind. The books, the articles, the arguments, the stories, the values we encode in language, it inherits our past. And it learns by watching us, the same way that a child learns from its parents, which means that the structure of the past matters. If the training corpus is full of incoherent cynicism and moral outsourcing, then we shouldn't act surprised when the outputs drift in the same direction. And if the corpus is full of tribal possession, full of us versus them dialogues that replace thoughtful ideologies that justify harm, then those patterns don't stay contained. They spread like viruses. They get recombined and they get optimized for. So I wanted to add a different narrative and an outlook to that river. And I'm not saying it's perfect. It's certainly not authoritative, but optimistic with a goal orientation that's not naive to who we are and how we came to be guided by the will to life. It's a frame that I'm trying to pose that tries to hold the full human problem, including death and suffering and truth and love and purpose and consciousness, and the ugly edges where purpose turns dark. It's a frame that insists that meaning is integrated memory, purpose is the proper chosen aim. Consciousness is the bridge between the two of them, and wisdom has to govern the entire structure in pursuit of a goal, and the ultimate goal in the omega point. So this is a small contribution, but now it's real because it's been released into the world. And perhaps that optimistic narrative for the future adds some small addition to ensuring that we continue to survive and thrive as humans within that narrative. And for me, apparently it was worth the cost because while this series didn't really resonate with the world, I found that it was enough for me to add a small contribution and help my own understanding of the world that we find ourselves in. Because if we're stepping into a world where we're building something we cannot fathom that is going to have its own goals and objectives, then the least we can do is leave behind a narrative structure that is worth inheriting. So let's get back to really the beginning. And let's define meaning and purpose within the larger context. Let's start with meaning. So here's the final definition that I want to leave you with. Meaning is inherently built on our past. It's the internal structure formed by what we've lived, by the memories we store, the memories we keep and the ones we rehearse, the ones that shape who we are. If something and someone truly matters to you, it doesn't just pass through your life and disappear. It leaves a trace. It gets written into you. It becomes part of your neural network and memory architecture. And because of that, it becomes part of your identity. Meaning is what the past becomes when it's integrated into living a human life. It's what stays. That's how you know that something matters to you, not by what you shout out, not by what you think you should care about, but by what you've stored in your mind and how it helps you operate in the world. If you want to find what's meaningful in your life, just look at what you can't forget. Look what still has power over you, to warm you or to haunt you. Look at what you feel gratitude for or regret. Look at things that you still remember, even if you don't want to. That's your meaning map. Because the memory isn't neutral. Your mind stores things, but only certain things. It stores what has value, something that has taught you, something that has shaped you. Perhaps it's something that threatened you or saved you, but it's forcing you to grow in some way because that's why it's stored there. As we've seen through this series, the memories that form meaning tend to gather around a few recurring themes. We've walked through many of those together, but I'm going to revisit some. Meaning is tied to experience. Again, these are not the moments that just happen to you, they happen into you. They burn themselves into our nervous system like a lightning bolt sometimes. It could be, I don't know, a place you went or a night you still remember. Or it could be a sunset that you saw 10 years ago. But when you close your eyes, you can still feel that environment. And sometimes meaning is awe. Sometimes it's wonder. Sometimes it's raw. It's like, oh, I was here and this happened to me and I felt that. Subjective experience is the first way that life writes itself into memory. And this is why nostalgia works. Nostalgia is not just your mind being soft or romantic, it's your nervous system reaching backwards and saying, that was real. That mattered and that shaped me. You're touching a node in the meaning network when you think back into your past. It's the imprint of a lived experience. It's that life happened and some part of it has left a permanent mark inside of you. And that mark makes you who you are. And likewise, meaning is also tied to relationships and shared experience rather than just personal experience. Most of what we remember isn't what happened in isolation, it's what happened with the people around us. We remember more when we share something together, whether that's laughter or suffering or triumph. Because this is one of the most fundamental truths we've surfaced in this series. Belonging isn't optional for humans. We're built to store meaning through the engagement with other people. A lot of that meaning is going to be relational memory. It's not what happened, but who stood with me while it happened. It's not what I achieved, but who saw me while I was working tirelessly across that chasm. It's not what I survived, but who didn't abandon me while I survived it. That's why love matters more than we want to admit. It's why friendship and family and tribe matter. Because those relationships, they're not social decoration. They're the memory structure. They're the scaffolding that makes life feel like life instead of just a series of disconnected events. Meaning is tied to people because people are the medium through which much of our life becomes worth remembering. But meaning is also tied to accomplishment. We store things that we do, that we build, that we finish, that we contribute to the world, usually at some cost to ourselves. It becomes, I did that, or I learned that, or I carried that burden and I didn't break. It might be some craft or art. It might be raising children. It might be something quiet and invisible that no one ever sees. But you see it, and you see the cost that it took. An accomplishment matters because it leaves a trace. It becomes part of that meaning bank that you store inside of you. It's one of the deepest human satisfactions to look back and know, I didn't just consume life, I added something to it. But, and here's something crucial that I want to name before we go further. Meaning is not just built from positive memories. Meaning is also built from negative ones. And this matters because people confuse meaning with comfort. Some of the most meaningful things in your life are meaningful precisely because they cost you. or because they warned you, or because they taught you what not to become. Meaning comes from the memories we return to from nourishment. Like they stabilize our identity and they restore gratitude. Because if you're exhausted or you're cynical or you're scared, positive memories may be the fuel from your past, but negative meaning also matters. Not because it makes you happy, but because it makes you wiser. Negative memories are helpful because they teach you what not to repeat. They warn you or they scar you in order to guide you. Your nervous system stores that pain as information. It's not there to torture you, but to protect you. But for some people, they don't get past it, and it does torture them. And that's why we talked about integrating that entire narrative story. So even if a memory hurts, it can still be meaningful. It's meaningful because it hurts. That's why I don't think meaning is always positive. It's an integrated past. Some of that integration is beautiful, but some of it is brutal. Both are real, and both guide the future. So now let's move to purpose. Purpose is different. Like meaning looks backwards at our life, but purpose looks forwards. It's the final destination. It's future oriented, like an aim or a goal that organizes your life. And it's not some like mystical calling that drops from the sky. It's not like a lightning bolt or it's given to you by God and I magically have my purpose. It's more like an orientation that you choose and commit to. Here's why that matters. There's an ancient framing that I think is more psychologically accurate than most modern self help that says you can discover your purpose. And the word comes from sin. And that means to miss the mark, like an archer who aims the arrow but falls short of its target. That's the important part is not that we miss, the important part is that we aim. The aim, guided by wisdom, is holy, even if we don't hit the mark, because aiming and then moving forward through action is what makes the future. Purpose is the thing that makes suffering bearable because it tells you what your suffering is for. It gives your motivational systems where to attach. It teaches your mind and your body that the pain has a cost and a direction, and that we willingly choose it. If you have no purpose, then your motivation rots. You just drift. You lose the ability to sacrifice without suffering because you don't know what the pain is for and you hide or you numb it. You don't know what to say yes to, and your refusal is what descends you into nihilism, numbing, or checking out. Purpose gives you a direction that makes the cost of existing worth paying for. Now, there's something that sounds paradoxical in here, but it's true. We don't control our outcomes, but we do control our aim. You can do everything right and still fail. That's life. Life is unfair. But a well-aimed life is still holy because it's real, it's honest, and it's worth pursuing. Now, if you listen to this whole series, you also know that there's the dangerous twin of purpose. Purpose and aim without wisdom distorts into fanaticism. And that's why the series had to go where it went. We had to study the motivation and the neurochemistry so that we could understand what drives aim. We had to study tribes and belonging so that we could see how aim becomes group possessed. We had to study the ideology so that we could see how aim becomes moral inversion. And we had to study evil so that we could see when the aim becomes desecration. So if purpose is that future vector, wisdom is the ultimate virtue that regulates that true vector. So we need to ask, is our aim aligned with wisdom? Does it defend life or does it degrade it? That's the line. And it's the only line that I make in the entire series. We ought to value life and we ought to value complex and conscious life. Purpose with wisdom becomes a path through the fog of our life map. Purpose without wisdom becomes possession by an idea that leads us into the abyss. But where do purpose and meaning meet? I think they meet in consciousness, the here and now. Meaning is the past integrated, and purpose is the future aimed. But neither of those actually exist except for in one place, right here and right now. Consciousness is the area where your past and your future become experienced within the present. The past doesn't just live out somewhere behind you, the past lives as memory in the present. The future doesn't live out there somewhere ahead of you, it lives as the aim within the present. So the conscious experience is the only place where meaning and purpose actually meet. It's the bridge where the past that you carry and the future that you're aiming to become live in a single reality. And that's why consciousness mattered so much at the start of this series. If you're conscious, you can do something that no other part of nature can do. You can hold the past and the future simultaneously in the present moment. You can integrate the memory and the aim into one moment, and you can suffer now for what matters later while being guided by wisdom. Meaning and purpose are a time-structured entity. Now, there is overlap. Like there's some meaning that points forward, and there's some purpose that redeems the past. But structurally, I think that's the geometry, with consciousness as the bridge. If you lose the balance, then you end up with distortion. If you only live into the past, you're going to live with tremendous regret. And if you only aim into the future, especially without wisdom, you're going to pursue fanaticism or burnout. But if you live consciously and you integrate both, then your memory becomes your identity. Your identity becomes your aim becomes your action, and your action loops back into new memories. And it continues throughout your entire life. That loop is what leads to a meaningful life. It's where the hero's journey narrative takes its structure in the way that we live our everyday interactions. Now we can finally close the original problem. Nihilism was the worm at the core. It's the terror that nothing matters, that everything is temporary, that death erases us, and the universe is indifferent. And that terror is not fake, and it certainly is a biological reality. And we talked about this early on. The existential realization that is unique to humans, that we will die, it has to go somewhere in your nervous system. If you don't have a narrative structure strong enough to hold it, you collapse into numbing or panic or paralysis or denial. Meaning and purpose in the pursuit of the ultimate goal help hold that terror at bay. Meaning makes the past non-empty. It makes the future non-empty. Meaning says something happened and it mattered. It shaped me and it wasn't nothing. Purpose says something will happen and I'm aiming towards it and I'm not drifting into the abyss. Together, they say that the story is not pointless. The story is something that we participate in writing and unfolding, and we're a part of that narrative journey. Nihilism says that the universe doesn't care, so nothing matters. But meaning and purpose, guided by wisdom, say the universe may not care, but the conscious fact of existence says otherwise. The miracle of existence and the directionality that we see in the increasing complexity points towards an actual ultimate purpose. That's the antidote to nihilism, or at least that's my contribution to the antidote to nihilism. But here's what we also learned as the series unfolded. Nihilism's not the only threat. It's one cliff, but fanaticism is the other. If nihilism is falling into nothing matters, then fanaticism is boldly asserting that only this matters. And that's why the meeting points matter so much. Because if you don't have meaning, then you're vulnerable to nihilism. And when you don't have wisdom, you're vulnerable to fanaticism. When meaning and purpose are held together in conscious mindfulness, fanaticism loses its fuel. Because meaning anchors you to reality. Meaning reminds you that life is complicated and that people are human and that history is scarred. And you can sit through those thoughts and emotions in the present. Consciousness is the place where you notice that so that you stop slipping into an inversion. Noticing is the moral difference between a life aimed wisely and a life aimed fanatically. Evil, as we defined it in the last episode, is the willful desecration of life with moral justification. It's not harm. It's harm plus that the harm is deserved, righteous, necessary, or holy. But meaning and purpose, guided by wisdom, it defeats evil. Because evil requires a specific collapse. It requires the rejection of life and the failure to defend it. And as we talked about, when we're consciously aware of the evil that is being made around us, we can make a choice to stand up against that, especially when it's small. So the full structure looks something like this. Meaning redeems the past into identity so nihilism can't erase you. Purpose redeems the future into aim so it doesn't destroy you with your tribal tendency. And consciousness holds both together in harmony. And the union of all three under wisdom makes evil harder to justify and harder to carry. That's what this series has been building towards, a narrative structure that combines the hero's journey into a grounded approach for the good life. So let's return to that horizon line that's been underlying the entire series, and the aim that was there from the beginning, even though it was a bit vague. So early on, I made a speculative claim, not as dogma or as certainty, but certainly a serious possibility that organizes meaning and purpose at the cosmic scale. And that was this, that life is better than not life, that life is pushing against entropy and the ultimate end state of the universe. And life grows because it's increasing in complexity over time. And the universe, from what we observe, seems to be bending in a direction of increasing complexity. And you can see that due to the fact of your own existence. Whatever else the universe is doing, one thing it appears to be doing is at least producing one island of life that is increasingly capable of awareness, memory, planning, love, invention, and moral choice. And that arrow of complexity looks real to me. And if that arrow is real, then the omega point is a coherent idea. It's the culmination of life and complexity into a final intelligence, a final kind of ultimate convergence of consciousness, truth, and love. I don't know how we could call that anything else other than God. And so I made a second speculative claim. If that trajectory is true, then pursuing meaning and purpose is not just what we should do, it's participation in the universe's direction. It's the pursuit of the divine. It's not a cheap version where you say thoughts and prayers. It's a real hard version where you build, love, sacrifice, and aim, where you tell the truth even when it's costly, where you carry your cross consciously without passing it downstream, and where you defend dignity instead of desecrating it. In that frame, the omega point becomes the ultimate fight against meaninglessness because it represents a future where consciousness and life doesn't vanish into the void. Aiming at a life is holy and worthy. It's the refusal of the void and of entropy. It's the refusal of desecration, and it's the refusal of nihilism. And it's a choice to participate in becoming what we aim towards in the future. That was the horizon behind this whole series. So in closing, I'm honestly grateful that you were a part of this. I didn't know where it was going when I started. I just had the pressure inside of me to get these ideas out of my head and turn them into something coherent. I needed to see if they held together when I spoke them out loud. And if you listened, if you stayed with me through this long series and the abstractions and the detours and the darknessness and the, weightiness of the conversations, I genuinely hope you got something out of it. I hope some part of this helped you name your own experience more clearly, or help you to aim your own life more wisely. This is the last episode in the series on meaning and purpose. It's been an adventure for me. And I want to thank you for being a part of that adventure. For the past 7 years, these ideas have been stuck in my head like splinters. And this series was my way of pulling them out one by one, laying them on the table, and seeing what was true, what was useful, and what could actually be lived, with a framework that would help build a foundation for a life worth living. I don't think I'm going to add anything to this framework for a while. Maybe I will someday. But right now, it feels like the end of the journey that I needed to take. So thank you for walking with me. I'm glad you're here. I hope you build meaning from the life that you've lived. I hope you aim purposefully towards where you want to live. And I hope you keep the bridge so that your past and your future stay united in a single life. Good luck on your own journey. And whatever comes next, I wish you the best.